They laughed because they believed the quiet woman standing before them had made the most impossible claim of the day, but before the morning was over, not one of them would find the courage to laugh again. Emily Carter stepped through the revolving doors of Sterling Heritage Bank carrying nothing more than a faded canvas tote bag and a neatly organized leather folder tucked beneath her arm. At 35 years old, she had grown comfortable with being overlooked. Her pale blue cotton blouse, dark blue jeans, and clean white sneakers reflected practicality rather than wealth, and her shoulder-length light brown hair rested naturally around a face that carried quiet confidence instead of the need to impress anyone. She greeted the security officer with a warm smile before making her way across the polished marble floor toward the customer service desk. Morning sunlight poured through the towering glass windows, casting bright reflections across the elegant lobby where customers waited beneath sparkling chandeliers and soft instrumental music drifted through the air. Business professionals discussed investments while retirees patiently organized paperwork, and employees welcomed well-dressed clients with polished smiles that seemed almost rehearsed. Emily waited politely until the receptionist looked up from her computer. "Good morning," Emily said kindly. "I would like to speak with the branch director regarding ownership documentation connected to this bank." The receptionist blinked in surprise before forcing a polite smile. "Ownership documentation?" Emily nodded. "Yes. There are several records I need to review concerning the ownership structure." The receptionist studied Emily's simple clothing before exchanging an amused glance with another employee standing nearby. "May I ask exactly what your connection is?" Emily answered calmly. "I am one of the owners." For just a brief second the lobby became unusually quiet. Then the second employee gave a small laugh, believing Emily had made a harmless joke. The receptionist tried to hide her own smile but could not completely suppress it. "Ma'am," she replied carefully, "the ownership of this institution is handled at a much higher corporate level." Emily maintained the same gentle expression. "I understand. That is why I am requesting to speak with the branch director." Another employee overheard the conversation and quietly whispered something to a coworker. Within moments, several staff members glanced toward Emily with expressions ranging from curiosity to disbelief. A customer standing nearby shook his head with a faint smile before returning to his phone. None of them saw a composed woman making a reasonable request. They saw only someone whose appearance did not match the importance of her words. A few moments later, Branch Director Melissa Grant emerged from a nearby office wearing a tailored navy business suit and carrying a tablet. She approached with practiced professionalism, although the slight smile on her face suggested she had already formed an opinion before hearing Emily speak. "Good morning," Melissa said politely. "I understand you have questions regarding bank ownership." Emily nodded respectfully. "Yes. I would appreciate access to the ownership records connected with my interest." Melissa paused, studying Emily from head to toe before answering. "I am afraid those records are not available to the public." Emily smiled gently. "I am not requesting them as a member of the public." Melissa folded her hands. "Then on whose behalf are you requesting them?" Emily looked directly into her eyes and answered with complete calm. "My own." The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat before another quiet laugh echoed behind the reception desk. No one inside the elegant lobby realized that the next few minutes would challenge every assumption they had just made. Emily remained perfectly still after the quiet laughter drifted across the reception area. She neither defended herself nor showed the slightest sign of embarrassment. Instead, she simply rested both hands on the leather folder she carried and waited patiently for the room to become quiet again. Branch Director Melissa Grant looked toward the employees behind the reception desk, encouraging them with a subtle glance to return to work before turning her attention back to Emily. "Ma'am," Melissa said in a measured professional tone, "I believe there has been a misunderstanding. Ownership records are confidential and may only be discussed with authorized individuals." Emily nodded politely. "I completely understand. That is precisely why I am here." Melissa maintained her courteous smile, although disbelief lingered in her eyes. "May I see some identification that confirms your authority?" Emily reached into her canvas tote bag and removed a small card holder. Before she could present anything, Melissa gently raised one hand. Actually, before we continue, perhaps you should explain exactly what you mean by ownership. Emily answered with complete calm. Several years ago, our family acquired a significant ownership interest in this institution through a long-term investment trust. I simply need to review updated documentation regarding today's board filing. Another employee quietly overheard the explanation and smiled as though listening to an unbelievable story. A young teller leaned toward a coworker and whispered softly, "She really believes she owns part of the bank." The coworker tried not to laugh, but a quiet chuckle escaped anyway. Nearby customers slowly began paying attention. An older couple exchanged curious glances while a businessman waiting near the investment offices folded his newspaper to observe the unusual conversation. Emily noticed every reaction but never responded to any of them. She had spent enough years serving on charitable boards and attending community meetings to understand that people often formed opinions before learning facts. Melissa folded her hands together. Our ownership group is very well documented. I know nearly every principal investor connected with this branch. Emily smiled gently. I imagine you do. Melissa continued, I do not recall seeing your name. Emily answered without hesitation. That is because I rarely attend public shareholder meetings. I prefer letting other people handle publicity. The statement caused another ripple of quiet amusement among two reception employees. One of them shook his head before returning to his computer screen. Melissa sighed softly, trying to remain patient. Ma'am, I do not wish to waste your time. Emily answered kindly, neither do I. The branch director looked toward the elegant waiting area beside the tall windows. Perhaps it would be best if you waited while we verify whether anyone from corporate is available. Emily nodded. That would be perfectly fine. She thanked Melissa sincerely before walking toward one of the comfortable chairs overlooking the downtown street. She crossed her legs, placed the leather folder neatly on her lap, and quietly removed her phone. Without hurry, she typed a brief message containing only 3 simple words. I am downstairs. She pressed send, locked the screen, and slipped the phone back into her canvas bag. No dramatic expression crossed her face. She simply leaned back and waited peacefully. Across the lobby, several employees continued smiling among themselves, convinced the unusual conversation had already come to an end. Melissa returned to her office believing she had handled an awkward situation professionally. None of them noticed that Emily never once asked for special treatment. She asked only for the opportunity to be heard. Outside the tall glass windows, a line of morning traffic moved steadily through the city streets beneath the bright spring sun. Inside the elegant bank, polished marble floors reflected the quiet routine of another ordinary business day. Yet somewhere only a few blocks away, someone had just received Emily's message, and every passing minute brought the bank closer to a moment that would permanently change the way everyone inside remembered that morning. Several quiet minutes passed, yet Emily never once looked impatient. She sat comfortably beside the tall windows with the leather folder resting neatly on her lap and the familiar canvas tote bag placed carefully at her feet. The elegant lobby continued moving with its ordinary rhythm as customers approached polished service counters, financial advisors welcomed scheduled appointments, and the soft sound of conversations blended with gentle instrumental music drifting through hidden speakers. To everyone around her, Emily appeared to be an ordinary visitor waiting for an answer she would probably never receive. Only Emily knew that every passing minute was bringing someone closer to the front entrance. Branch Director Melissa Grant returned briefly from her office and glanced toward the waiting area. She found Emily exactly where she had left her, quietly reading several pages inside the folder without showing the slightest frustration. Melissa walked toward the reception desk and spoke softly to the employees nearby. Has she asked to speak with anyone else? One receptionist shook her head. No. She has been completely polite. Another employee added with a faint smile, she has barely looked up from her paperwork. Melissa nodded. Good. Corporate will never confirm the story she shared, but let us allow her a little time before asking whether she wishes to leave. Although Melissa believed she was handling the situation professionally, a small feeling of uncertainty had begun to grow beneath her confidence. Emily did not behave like someone inventing an unbelievable story. She never argued, never raised her voice, and never attempted to persuade anyone. She simply waited with remarkable peace. Nearby, an elderly woman approached the waiting area carrying several documents and looked uncertain about where to sit. Emily immediately stood and offered her own chair with a warm smile. "Please, you look like you have been standing longer than I have." The woman smiled gratefully. "Thank you. That is very kind." Emily simply nodded before choosing another chair a few feet away. The small gesture caught the attention of a young teller who quietly watched from behind the counter. She found herself wondering why someone supposedly pretending to be an owner showed so much concern for complete strangers. A businessman waiting for an investment meeting glanced toward Emily and asked politely, "Have you been waiting long?" Emily smiled. "Not very long." "Are they helping you?" he continued. Emily answered gently, "Eventually, I believe they will." There was no bitterness in her voice, only quiet confidence. The businessman returned to his newspaper, puzzled by her calmness. Across the lobby, Melissa overheard part of the conversation and became even more curious. Most people challenged under similar circumstances would have demanded a supervisor or threatened complaints. Emily had done neither. She simply trusted that the truth did not require loud voices. Outside the bank, morning traffic flowed steadily beneath bright sunshine reflecting from nearby office buildings. A dark luxury sedan turned onto the avenue followed by another vehicle traveling at a respectful distance. The security officer standing near the entrance noticed the approaching cars but thought little of them at first. High-profile clients visited the branch from time to time, and elegant vehicles were not unusual in this part of the city. Emily quietly glanced at her phone as its screen illuminated with a short message. She read only 2 words before locking it again. "Almost there." A gentle smile crossed her face for only a second before she returned the phone to her bag. No one else noticed that simple message, but within moments the polished glass entrance doors would open once again, and every assumption that had filled the elegant lobby since Emily first walked inside would begin to disappear one quiet step at a time. The revolving doors turned slowly as the security officer straightened his posture the moment he recognized the man walking through the entrance. Jonathan Carter stepped into the lobby wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, polished dress shoes, and the quiet confidence of someone who never needed to announce his importance. He acknowledged the security officer with a friendly smile before looking across the spacious lobby as though searching for someone familiar. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," the security officer said respectfully. "Welcome back." Jonathan nodded warmly. "Good morning." "Thank you." The greeting immediately caught the attention of several employees. One receptionist looked toward another and whispered softly. Branch Director Melissa Grant stepped out of her office after hearing Jonathan's name. Her expression changed instantly as she walked quickly across the marble floor. "Mr. Carter," she said with genuine enthusiasm, extending her hand. "It is wonderful to see you again. If we had known you were coming, we would have prepared the executive conference room." Jonathan smiled politely as he shook her hand. "That is very thoughtful, but I am only here because my wife asked me to stop by." Melissa glanced toward the entrance, expecting another elegantly dressed guest to appear behind him. When no one entered, she looked back with mild confusion. "Your wife is here?" Jonathan nodded. "Yes. She sent me a message saying she had arrived several minutes ago." Melissa instinctively looked around the lobby, searching among the investment clients and business professionals waiting near the private offices. Jonathan's eyes, however, moved immediately toward the quiet seating area beside the windows where Emily still sat reading her folder with complete composure. His face brightened with unmistakable warmth. Without another word, he walked directly past Melissa and continued across the lobby. Every conversation nearby seemed to fade into silence. Employees paused in the middle of ordinary tasks while several customers looked up from their phones and newspapers. Emily noticed Jonathan approaching and smiled naturally, as though this were the most ordinary moment of the day. Jonathan reached her chair, gently picked up the familiar canvas tote bag resting beside her feet, and leaned down to greet her with a brief affectionate embrace. "I hope I did not keep you waiting," he said softly. Emily smiled. "Only a little. Were you able to finish what you came here to do?" Jonathan asked. Emily shook her head gently. "Not yet." There was no frustration in her voice, only quiet honesty. Melissa stood several feet away, watching the scene unfold as realization slowly settled across her face. The woman whose claim had been dismissed only minutes earlier was clearly not inventing a story. Jonathan turned toward Melissa with calm courtesy. "Good morning," he said. "I believe my wife was hoping to discuss ownership documentation." Melissa felt the confidence she had carried all morning begin to disappear. Around the lobby, employees exchanged uncertain glances as they remembered the laughter that had followed Emily's request. No one spoke. Even the customers who had quietly smiled earlier now watched in complete silence. Jonathan looked back at Emily with gentle concern. "Would you mind telling me exactly what happened after you arrived?" His question was asked without anger, accusation, or impatience. Yet as the final words settled into the quiet lobby, everyone standing within earshot understood that the answer would reveal far more than a simple misunderstanding. It would expose the difference between recognizing someone's appearance and recognizing their dignity, and no one inside Sterling Heritage Bank was prepared for what they were about to learn. Emily looked at Jonathan with the same peaceful expression she had carried since walking through the front doors of the bank. She did not glance toward the employees standing silently behind the reception desk, nor did she allow the sudden change in the atmosphere to influence the calm rhythm of her voice. "I asked to review the ownership documentation connected to my shares," she explained gently. "The staff believed I was mistaken, and I was asked to wait while the request was declined." Jonathan listened carefully without interrupting. After years of marriage, he knew Emily never exaggerated uncomfortable situations. If she described the morning in only a few sentences, then those few sentences contained the entire truth. He nodded thoughtfully before asking one final question. "Did anyone ask to review your documents?" Emily softly shook her head. "No. They decided before looking." Jonathan smiled kindly, not with disappointment, but with understanding. He turned toward Melissa and addressed her with complete courtesy. "Would it be possible for us to continue the conversation now?" Melissa immediately stepped forward. "Absolutely, Mr. Carter. Please accept my sincere apology. We would be honored to assist both of you immediately." Jonathan thanked her with a polite nod. "I appreciate that." He paused briefly before adding, "May I ask something first?" Melissa agreed without hesitation. Jonathan looked around the elegant lobby where several service desks remained available despite the earlier explanation that no one could assist Emily. "When my wife first arrived, was there any reason her documents could not have been reviewed?" The quiet question settled across the room. Melissa lowered her eyes for a moment before answering honestly. "No. There was not." Several employees quietly looked toward the polished marble floor. The receptionist remembered the amused smile that had crossed her face only minutes earlier. The young teller recalled whispering to a coworker instead of simply offering assistance. No one attempted to defend those choices now. Jonathan nodded respectfully. "Thank you for your honesty." Then he gently accepted the leather folder from Emily and placed it on the reception counter. "Inside these documents," he explained calmly, "are records connected to the Carter Family Trust. The trust has maintained a significant ownership interest in this institution for many years." Melissa slowly opened the folder. As she reviewed the carefully organized documents, her expression changed completely. Every certificate, legal record, and corporate filing had been professionally prepared and fully authenticated. Emily's name appeared exactly where she had quietly said it would. Melissa looked up with visible surprise. "Mrs. Carter," she whispered, almost unable to continue. Emily smiled gently. "I told you I preferred not to discuss these matters publicly." Jonathan rested one hand lightly on the folder. My wife rarely attends shareholder meetings because she spends most of her time managing our education foundation and community programs. She has never believed appearances should determine how people are treated. The elderly gentleman who had been observing the morning from the waiting area smiled softly as the truth finally became clear. Several customers exchanged thoughtful glances, remembering how respectfully Emily had treated everyone despite receiving little respect herself. Melissa slowly closed the folder before looking directly at Emily. I owe you a sincere apology. Emily answered with the same kindness she had shown from the beginning. Everyone makes assumptions sometimes. Melissa shook her head gently. Not everyone allows those assumptions to guide their decisions. I did. A deep silence filled the elegant lobby. It was no longer the silence of disbelief or quiet laughter. It was the silence that comes when people recognize an important lesson unfolding before their own eyes. At that moment, everyone inside Sterling Heritage Bank understood that the greatest mistake made that morning had never been misunderstanding a claim of ownership. It had been judging the value of a person before taking the time to truly see who was standing in front of them. Melissa carefully gathered the documents from the reception counter and invited Emily and Jonathan into the executive meeting room overlooking the main lobby. The atmosphere inside Sterling Heritage Bank had changed completely. Only minutes earlier, several employees had quietly questioned Emily's claim. Now every conversation had faded into thoughtful silence as staff members watched the couple walk across the polished marble floor with calm dignity. Emily carried herself exactly as she had when she first entered the building. Her simple blouse, faded canvas tote bag, and gentle smile remained unchanged. The only difference was that everyone had finally chosen to listen before judging. Inside the conference room, sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating the long walnut table where board meetings were normally held. Melissa personally pulled out a chair for Emily before taking a seat across from her. Jonathan quietly sat beside his wife without saying a word. He had never come to prove anyone wrong. He had come only because Emily had asked him to. Melissa took a slow breath before speaking. Mrs. Carter, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an explanation. Emily smiled kindly. Please do not feel pressured to explain. We all make decisions with the information we believe we have. Melissa lowered her eyes for a moment. That is true, but today I allowed appearance to become part of my judgment. That should never happen inside this institution. Emily nodded gently, recognizing that is the first step toward changing it. Jonathan looked toward Melissa with quiet respect. My wife has always believed that mistakes become valuable only when they lead to better decisions. Melissa appreciated the words more than she expected. She opened the ownership records once more before carefully reviewing every page. Everything is exactly as you described, she admitted. The Carter Family Trust has been one of our largest long-term ownership partners for years. Emily smiled softly. The documents were never the difficult part. Melissa looked up with curiosity. What was? Emily answered without hesitation. Helping people remember that respect should never require proof. The room became completely still. Outside the glass walls, employees continued serving customers while occasionally glancing toward the executive meeting room, wondering how the conversation was unfolding. Inside, Melissa quietly closed the folder. May I ask why you came personally instead of sending legal representatives? Emily rested her hands peacefully on the table. Because ownership is not only about investments. It is about understanding the experience every customer has when they walk through these doors. If I never stand where ordinary people stand, I cannot honestly say I understand what this bank represents. Jonathan smiled proudly. He had heard Emily express the same philosophy countless times throughout their marriage. Melissa leaned back thoughtfully. I have attended leadership conferences for years, she admitted, but I do not think anyone has ever explained responsibility as clearly as you just did. Emily laughed softly. Sometimes the simplest lessons stay with us the longest. Melissa nodded before making a quiet promise. Beginning today, I will personally review our customer service training. Every employee will understand that no person's appearance should ever influence the welcome they receive. Emily extended her hand across the table. That is all I hoped would come from today. Melissa warmly shook her hand. In that simple gesture, the morning found its true resolution. No celebration followed. No dramatic announcement echoed through the elegant bank. There was only a quiet understanding shared between three people who recognized that genuine leadership was never measured by authority, ownership, or financial success. It was measured by the willingness to treat every stranger with equal dignity before knowing anything about the life they had lived. When the meeting concluded, Melissa walked beside Emily and Jonathan as they returned to the main lobby. The atmosphere inside Sterling Heritage Bank no longer resembled the one that had greeted Emily earlier that morning. Conversations grew quieter as employees respectfully looked toward the couple, not because they feared authority, but because they had witnessed humility responding to misunderstanding with remarkable grace. Emily carried the same faded canvas tote bag over her shoulder and the same leather folder beneath her arm. Nothing about her appearance had changed. Only the way people chose to see her had changed. Melissa paused near the reception desk and addressed the employees gathered nearby. Her voice remained calm, but every word carried sincere conviction. Before Mr. and Mrs. Carter leave, there is something I would like all of us to remember. The lobby gradually became silent. Receptionists, financial advisors, tellers, and even several waiting customers turned their attention toward her. Melissa continued, "This morning we allowed assumptions to influence our decisions. We believed appearance could tell us who deserved immediate attention and who did not. That mistake belongs to me first, because leadership begins with example." Several employees lowered their eyes. The receptionist who had first smiled at Emily quietly folded her hands together. The young teller who had whispered to a coworker looked genuinely disappointed in herself. Emily stepped forward before the silence became uncomfortable. "Please do not be too hard on yourselves," she said gently. "Every person has moments they wish they could handle differently. What matters most is what we choose to do after those moments." Her words softened the atmosphere immediately. Jonathan smiled quietly beside her, knowing that Emily had always believed correction carried greater value when it was offered with kindness instead of embarrassment. Melissa nodded gratefully. "Mrs. Carter is right. Today is not about blame. It is about becoming better tomorrow than we were this morning." The senior teller slowly stepped forward. "Mrs. Carter," she said sincerely, "I should have spoken when I realized we had available service desks. I stayed silent because I assumed someone else knew better. I am truly sorry." Emily smiled warmly. "Thank you for your honesty. Speaking now takes courage too." The young woman visibly relaxed. Around the lobby, several employees exchanged thoughtful glances. They recognized that respect inside the workplace included encouraging one another to question unfair decisions instead of quietly accepting them. Melissa looked toward her management team. "Beginning next week, every employee, including myself, will participate in new customer experience workshops. We will review not only procedures but also the values behind those procedures." Jonathan finally spoke. "Policies help organizations function. Character determines whether those policies serve people well." Melissa nodded with appreciation. "I will remember that." Nearby, the elderly customer who had observed much of the morning smiled as he prepared to leave. He quietly remarked to another customer, "I think this bank learned something valuable today." The other customer nodded in agreement. Emily thanked every employee who had assisted during the meeting, including the security officer who had greeted her with kindness from the moment she arrived. Before walking toward the entrance, she paused beside the reception desk where the morning had begun. She looked at the receptionist with a gentle smile and simply said, "I hope the rest of your day goes well." The receptionist smiled back with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter. I promise I will remember today for the rest of my career." Emily nodded softly before turning toward the glass doors. As sunlight poured across the polished marble floor, everyone inside understood that the most important change had never been discovering who Emily was. It was discovering who they themselves wanted to become after meeting her. Emily and Jonathan stepped through the revolving doors into the warm afternoon sunlight, leaving behind an elegant building that looked exactly the same from the outside yet had quietly changed within. The city continued moving with its familiar rhythm as office workers crossed busy intersections, delivery trucks rolled past polished storefronts, and distant traffic blended into the steady soundtrack of downtown life. Emily adjusted the canvas tote bag on her shoulder while Jonathan walked beside her carrying nothing except the satisfaction of knowing the morning had ended with understanding instead of resentment. Neither of them spoke for several moments. They did not need to. Both understood that the greatest victories rarely arrived with applause. Back inside Sterling Heritage Bank, Melissa remained standing in the lobby long after the couple had disappeared from view. She looked around at the reception area where the morning had begun and quietly reflected on every decision that had led to that unforgettable conversation. Then she gathered the management team for an unexpected meeting. Employees assembled around the customer service area, uncertain about what would happen next. Melissa looked at each face before speaking. Today was difficult, she began calmly, but I believe it will become one of the most valuable lessons this branch has ever experienced. No one interrupted. Every employee listened carefully. Melissa continued, starting tomorrow morning, every customer will receive the same welcome before we know anything about their occupation, clothing, financial history, or social status. Respect must become our first service, not our last. The word settled quietly across the lobby. The receptionist who had first questioned Emily slowly nodded. I understand now, she admitted. When I looked at her, I thought I already knew her story. Melissa answered gently. That was our mistake. We believed appearance could tell us everything worth knowing. The senior teller spoke next. It never occurred to me that someone carrying a simple canvas bag could help shape the future of this bank. Melissa smiled thoughtfully. Perhaps that is exactly why today's lesson matters. During the following weeks, new customer service workshops were introduced throughout the branch. Employees practiced greeting every visitor with the same warmth, whether they arrived wearing expensive business suits or comfortable everyday clothing. Managers encouraged staff to listen first, ask thoughtful questions second, and make assumptions never. Slowly, the atmosphere inside Sterling Heritage Bank became noticeably different. Customers commented on the welcoming environment, employees communicated with greater confidence, and small moments of kindness became part of the daily routine rather than rare exceptions. One quiet morning several weeks later, a middle-aged man wearing worn work boots and a faded jacket entered the lobby carrying a stack of documents. Months earlier he might have been overlooked. Instead, the receptionist immediately smiled and welcomed him by saying, "Good morning. We are happy you are here. How may we help you today?" Melissa happened to witness the interaction from her office. A quiet smile crossed her face because she recognized that the change was genuine. No one mentioned Emily or Jonathan during that ordinary moment, yet their influence remained present in every respectful greeting offered throughout the branch. Across the city, Emily continued her work with the Family Education Foundation while Jonathan focused on business responsibilities, neither expecting recognition for what had happened. They never spoke publicly about that morning because they believed meaningful change did not require attention. It required consistency. The memory they carried was not one of being doubted. It was the hope that every stranger walking through those glass doors afterward would experience something better than they had, proving that true ownership is measured not by the shares written on paper but by the willingness to leave every place more compassionate than it was before. Nearly 1 year later, the story of that ordinary morning had quietly become part of Sterling Heritage Bank's culture, although very few people knew the names of those who had inspired the change. New employees learned from their first day that every customer deserved the same welcome, the same patience, and the same respect before anyone knew their profession, financial standing, or personal history. Managers no longer measured excellence only by efficiency or performance reports. They also measured it by the experience each visitor carried home after walking through the front doors. Melissa often reflected on the conversation she had shared with Emily inside the executive meeting room. Whenever she welcomed a new employee, she repeated the same simple principle that had transformed her own leadership. Listen before you assume. Respect before you decide. Those words gradually became part of the branch's identity. One bright spring morning, Emily returned to the bank carrying the same faded canvas tote bag and the same neatly organized leather folder she had carried months earlier. She wore another simple blouse, comfortable jeans, and familiar white sneakers. Nothing about her appearance suggested extraordinary influence, and that was exactly the way she preferred it. As soon as she entered the lobby, the security officer greeted her warmly by name. The receptionist smiled with genuine happiness. Several employees welcomed her exactly as they welcomed every other customer who entered that morning. Emily quietly noticed something even more meaningful than their kindness toward her. A young college student carrying a backpack was immediately invited to a service desk. An elderly couple received patient assistance with complicated paperwork. A construction worker in dusty boots was greeted with the same professional warmth as a businessman arriving in an expensive tailored suit. No one appeared surprised by these interactions because they had become the new normal. Melissa walked over with a bright smile. "Mrs. Carter, it is wonderful to see you again." Emily returned the smile. "It is wonderful to be back." Melissa looked around the busy lobby before speaking softly. "Do you notice anything different?" Emily slowly looked across the room once more and smiled. "Yes," she answered. "No one is being measured by appearances anymore." Melissa nodded proudly. "That is because of the lesson you shared with us." Emily gently shook her head. "Not because of me. Because all of you chose to learn from it." Jonathan arrived a few minutes later after finishing another meeting nearby. As he stepped into the lobby, he found Emily quietly helping an elderly customer understand a banking form while waiting for her own appointment. He smiled to himself because she had once again chosen kindness without expecting recognition. When the couple prepared to leave, Melissa walked them to the entrance. "Thank you," she said sincerely. Emily looked surprised. "For what?" Melissa smiled warmly. "For reminding us that ownership is not only written on legal documents. It is reflected in the responsibility people accept for improving the lives of others." Emily looked at Jonathan before quietly taking his hand. Together they stepped outside into the warm afternoon sunshine, leaving behind a bank that had become stronger not because new investors had arrived, but because its people had changed. The city continued moving around them exactly as it always had, yet countless ordinary customers would now enter Sterling Heritage Bank without ever realizing that one quiet woman carrying a simple canvas tote bag had helped reshape its culture forever. Some people leave behind buildings, fortunes, or impressive titles. Emily left behind something far more valuable. She reminded everyone she met that true dignity begins the moment we choose to treat every stranger with equal respect, because the greatest measure of character is never found in what someone owns, but in how they choose to honor the worth of every human being they meet.